gut. Ja, die Unknown Unknowns, das ist unser Thema und die treiben uns um. Wir wollen Transformation gestalten und unter diesem Stichwort freue ich mich ganz besonders jetzt Geoff Mulgan begrüßen zu dürfen und ihn einmal hier auf die Bühne zu bitten. Sir Geoff Mulgan ist Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy und Social Innovation am University College London und auch Advisor oder Senior Advisor beim The New Institute. Und ja, seine Keynote beschäftigt sich damit, how to govern the unknown unknowns. Geoff Mulgan, welcome. I'm very excited that you are here this morning. From where are you calling in?
From London. And vielen Dank, Martha, und vielen Dank für die Einladung. Tut mir leid, dass ich bin nicht in Berlin mit Sie heute, instead in Zoom and in English. So,
excellent.
Shall I begin?
Yes, maybe one quick question before we start. So what would you say is the one key message or lessons learned you want us to walk away with after your keynote?
So I am going to question the Donald Rumsfeld idea of unknown unknowns. I think this is misleading. And instead, I believe that the essence of 21st century government and governance is hunger for knowledge of all kinds, which will always be imperfect, but not unknowable. So I want to almost reverse the Donald Rumsfeld claim.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I will share some slides, so you don't have to look at my face this early on in the morning. And what I'm going to talk about is governing unknowns, but also the challenges of how governments steer. And this is, I hope, relevant to your new coalition. Any government which has big goals like decarbonization, reducing poverty, handling pandemics, these are relevant to. We all, I think, probably have some image in our mind of government as this monstrous leviathan which knows everything. Everyone who has worked in real governments knows it's the almost opposite of that. Real governments have a bit of hierarchy, but they're also messy networks. And most things they do, they don't really know very much about what they're doing. They see the world through a glass darkly, to quote. Now, I said I would talk about Donald Rumsfeld. He is famous for his comment on the world, including unknown unknowns. And to start off, I wanted to question this. The most famous thing he did in the world was the invasion of Iraq and the complete failure to manage the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq. And I think this is a classic case where it wasn't about things being unknown, but there were knowns he didn't know. Lots of people knew what was going to happen. Lots of people warned about what was going to happen. But he at the top of the hierarchy in the Pentagon was oblivious to it and didn't have the right means of tapping in to the right insights, the right knowledge, the right signals. And this seems to me a much more common pattern in governments. And this is why I think it's almost dangerous to invoke a sort of mystical notion of unknown unknowns, but instead to look at degrees of knowledge and what governments can do. And as I'll explain in the next few minutes, I think the methods available to governments are very different from those even 10 or 20 years ago, their abilities to orchestrate knowledge. This is a picture of the Challenger space shuttle disaster, which actually makes exactly the same point. Many years ago, when I worked running strategy in the British government, we were given the task of overhauling risk management, how to handle risk for the whole nation. And we looked at lots of these examples, oil spills, disasters, and so on. And nearly always, it turns out that someone low in the hierarchy saw the problem coming, but the hierarchy ensured their messages did not get to the top. And that was the case with the Challenger space shuttle. Junior engineers knew there was a big problem, warned about it, but they were overridden. And this is I think, the universal pattern. So for me, the question we're asking should be about how can any system or hierarchy mobilize all these different kinds of knowledge, often from low in the hierarchy or from outside the organization, rather than, let's say, a mystical invocation of unknown unknowns. I hope I will persuade you of this in the next few minutes. And I think this is part of a much bigger shift in governments. All governments throughout history have been interested in intelligence, but usually that meant intelligence about foreign powers, intelligence about internal threats, intelligence about the military. But now I think good governance is about organizing intelligence on everything: education, healthcare, unemployment, ecology. And that requires being more precise about the limits of knowledge, but also more energetic in learning, sharing, and discovering what is known. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of theory. This came from work with many strategy teams around the world. We found this a very useful framework for helping governments think about what they could do. So in almost any field of policy, governments will have some amount of power and they will have some amount of knowledge. And crudely speaking, you can put this into a 2x2 framework. Those fields where government have lots of power and lots of knowledge, those where they have none, those where they have power but not much knowledge, those where they have knowledge but not much power. And these lead to very different approaches. So there are a few where governments have lots of power and knowledge and they can pull a lever with some predictability about what will happen. Building a road, sometimes tax collection is like that. There are then, number one on the left top, things like a pandemic, where no one quite knows what the Omicron variant will be. And so you have to learn very fast. Governments have a lot of power to lock down, to vaccinate, but they have to have very rapid emergent strategies to cope with it. And then number four, there'll be fields where you actually know a lot about what needs to be done, but you don't have the power. Most international relations is of this kind, so you have to collaborate, reward, incentivize, and inspire. And in my experience, many governments think they are in square number 2, but much more often they are in 1 or 4. This doesn't mean they're unknown unknowns, but there will be limitations both on their knowledge and their power. And therefore policy design has to be designed to generate new knowledge or sometimes to generate new power. Now, it's a very quick run through of a bit of theory, but as I say, I found this very useful in many fields as a way of bringing clarity to bear on policy. So what I want to now turn to is some thoughts about how governments can steer towards things like a net zero economy, or solving unemployment, or handling public health issues with this unevenness of power and knowledge, which is part of the nature of the world. I'll go through these very quickly. The first point is in fact a new one. It was not really part of how we thought 10, 20 years ago when I say ran strategy and policy in the UK government, but I think it is central to the issues of the 2020s. And this essentially is that almost any policy field now, we need to be organizing the best available data and knowledge as a commons, as something shared. I call this an intelligence assembly, in order to allow all the players in business and civil society and government to themselves adapt in real time. This has been very clear through the pandemic, where some governments, particularly in East Asia, have been much more successful at mobilizing data of all kinds, mobile phone data, credit card data, local data, to help them navigate the crisis. In Europe, we've been much blunter. We haven't had the same sophistication of tools for all sorts of reasons. But I think this is what we will need in almost every policy area, an equivalent of this. And in terms of knowledge, one of the things I've been working on the last 10 years is creating institutions whose job it is to orchestrate shared knowledge for teachers or police officers or municipalities. And at the moment, I help run a thing which is on the top left there, IPO, International Public Policy Observatory on COVID, where we try to synthesize the best available evidence and global experience on things like online learning, or the mental health challenges of the elderly or teenagers, or what's to be done on homelessness. and sharing all of that knowledge in very easily accessible ways so that people throughout the system can adapt. This seems to me core to every field of policy now, but it's done very unevenly across Europe. And often there is no organization which owns this as a task. Now, that knowledge will always be imperfect, but it's far better to have the best available knowledge than no knowledge at all. And we're looking at interesting things. So just a few days ago, we held a session yesterday actually on social capital. What do we know about the effects of social capital on the pandemic? What should social capital be? What role should it play in recovery plans next year? And there is a lot of evidence, but we need institutions to pull that together and make it usable. I think this is absolutely key for the net zero plans of your government and many others. At the moment, no country has a proper set of institutions organizing the knowledge about things like home retrofitting to make that easily accessible. And the data needed for net zero is usually owned by electricity companies. It's separated, it's balkanized, it's siloed, it is not organized as a commons. So one of our big barriers to achieving a net zero economy is so far as a failure to organize the knowledge and data we need to get there. We can come back to that if you want. A second element of this approach is to say that often what a government needs to do is set a direction, like a net zero target, but because nobody will know exactly how to get there, you need much more systematic experimentation. This is being done globally through things like JPAL on development. Countries like Finland and Canada have committed to this experimental approach. I've been part of 2 teams in the UK running large-scale experiments on economic policy, behavioral insights, and there's a whole host of methods for doing test beds and demonstrators. The key is to do this systematically and on a large scale, so there is constant energetic experiment to generate new knowledge to guide policy in the future. There's then the need to have some shared picture of where we are all heading. And any government needs to combine these different time horizons. You'll see here the short time horizons of crises and firefighting, medium-term horizons of incremental innovation and performance, but then also the longer horizons of radical innovation and generational time. And there are lots of methods for looking at megatrends in genomics or AI or climate change. And in fact, the lesson of these is you can get a fairly good idea of the broad likely trends. These are not so unknown. The world isn't so bizarre that suddenly the world is going to become younger. It's getting older. That's fairly predictable. The IPCC has shown you can actually make pretty good predictions on carbon levels. The key is to turn those into shared ideas. And you mentioned the work I've been doing with the New Institute. And part of that is trying to mobilize the best available knowledge in universities and elsewhere, not just to understand the likely future, but also design preferable futures. And I call this exploratory social science, where you get thinking on what might a net zero economy look like in 20 or 30 years' time? How might we be regulating AI several generations into the future? How might we be dealing with a much older population? And at the moment, this work is not done adequately, either in universities or in academia. And there's a big gap there. And again, the future is not knowable in precise terms, but in broad terms, I think it is, with serious effort. And again, many other governments around the world, like Singapore, actually devote a lot of resources to this shared picture of the potential future. Now, this relates to the whole issue of risk. As I said, I was responsible for designing a risk management strategy quite a while ago, which actually worked quite well for some time. The UK government, like many others, brings out annual risk registers of big risks. What is striking, if you look back at that, is nearly always pandemics was the top risk. There were usually other risks like financial crashes or cybersecurity attacks. But almost everyone realized that a global pandemic was likely to be the biggest, highest impact shock the world faced. But most of them got wrong the exact form it would take. They often thought it would be a flu, not a coronavirus. And this is, I think, the more general point I would make. In fact, most mappings of risks are fairly accurate in broad terms, but not very accurate in precise terms or timing terms. So for governments, the implication, and we acknowledged this when we designed our risk framework 20 years ago, is do horizon scanning, do regular simulations so your decision makers experience what it's like to be in a pandemic or a big terrorist attack or a cyber breakdown, but realize you won't be able to predict in detail. So track the leading indicators, which may be signals of what's going to happen, and then be sure you can react very fast when the shock happens. And the shock will happen not quite in the form you've described. So again, it's not unknown unknowns, it's partial knowns and partial responses is, to my mind, the correct response. And that's definitely true now of things like chip shortages and supply chains. This has been signaled for quite a few years. This will become a big problem. And the key, which is how you respond in practical terms to an issue like this. I want to just very quickly talk about money. I've been working in the last year with a number of governments, mainly the UAE, on how we actually make budgeting and public finance better aligned with both long-term goals, but also the organization of knowledge. And our diagnosis is in most countries, I think including Germany, certainly the UK, most of budgets are still set annually. All budgets related to people in education, health, social security are annual. They don't have an investment approach. They don't look at how our spending in 2022 might lead to savings in 2032 or 42. We have very weak links between finance and impacts or use of data to track results. Our use of balance sheets is chronically bad and backward, with almost no use of balance sheets for natural capital or intangibles, and often a severe lack of transparency. So we try to look at many of the promising innovations around the world, methods to try and look at the actual impacts of money, looking at well-being budgets, phenomenon-based budgeting, where you look not by department, but by population group or a task, all the lessons to be learned from fields like impact investment, and how you can use open data to make budgets smarter. And there's not time to go into the details of this, but I think this is a crucial part of our conversation has to be, how can finance generate the kind of insights and knowledge we need to know what effects will be achieved by, let's say, a budget this year on our human capital balance sheet, our physical capital balance sheet, our natural capital balance sheet in 10 or 20 years' time. This has to be part of what good governance means in the future, because budgets still drive so much of behavior. And another point, which I've been working on with many governments, is the structures question. We still mainly have 19th century structures where under a chancellor or a prime minister or a president, there are departments and agencies in vertical silos. But we know that nearly all of our big issues are cross-cutting. And we, in fact, have many methods for organizing horizontal structures and processes in governments. These are just a few of them. Teams, shared targets, shared budgets, shared back office, double keys, platform services, knowledge management in cross-cutting ways, all of which help the whole of government to think and act in a more holistic, more coherent way. But in some ways, what's remarkable to me is how persistent the old traditional vertical silos are, and how still in so many governments, this makes them much less flexible, much less adaptive, much less able to use knowledge than they should be. And then seventh and finally, one thing I've just been working on recently, and it's related to the pandemic, is the ability to synthesize different kinds of knowledge. How does a chancellery or a president's office actually make sense of different kinds of knowledge? And again, this is an opposite perspective to Donald Rumsfeld. This is a list of some of the kinds of knowledge relevant to any minister making a decision about Omicron now. I won't list all of these, but you can see these: statistical, policy, scientific, disciplinary, professional, practical knowledge, ethical knowledge, technical, engineering knowledge, lived experience knowledge. All of these are relevant. But the question then is, how do you actually integrate all of those kinds of knowledge in a coherent way? And if you're interested, this paper, which we put out 2 weeks ago, set out the methods which should be being used in the centers of government to do this job of synthesis, using the best available advice, but absorbing it and synthesizing it to guide action. And my argument would be, in most governments, this is a missing piece, even when they have fantastically good scientific advice and social science advice coming in, they're often missing this capacity to synthesize. Now, this is a sort of diagram I did for the Finnish government a little while ago, which tries to bring these points together into really a picture of how a government might steer in conditions of uncertainty. At the top, setting national goals for systems like energy, food, and health. Some of those turning into lander or city level plans, but also mobilizing business innovation, social innovation, citizen innovation, bottom up. The crucial point being, though, the 2 boxes at the top is the orchestration of shared knowledge and shared data as the way in which a whole system can coordinate itself in real time. That cannot anymore be done by the government itself. These have to be done as commons, as shared resources to help a whole system adapt. And this, in a nutshell, again, is why I'm a sort of skeptical of the Donald Rumsfeld view. And giving me some hope for this is what I see happening around the world with many initiatives of different governments. As yesterday, I was doing work with the Bangladesh government, which is doing extraordinary work on collective intelligence mobilization. And the United Nations has backed a series of accelerator labs in over 90 countries using collective intelligence methods, very much in the spirit of I described, to reinvigorate democracy, healthcare, public services, to speed up innovation and problem solving. And if you're interested, the report the UN brought out last summer, which documents many of these examples, how they're using artificial intelligence and human collective intelligence, to me, paints a picture of the future of government everywhere. And I sometimes feel Europe may be falling slightly behind some of the developing world, which maybe is more agile in its use of these new tools. I wrote about some of this in my book 3 years ago on collective intelligence, but the practice has now moved far ahead of what I was writing about in that book. Very sophisticated, hunger for knowledge, learning in real time. So, in summary, what I'm arguing is the opposite of Donald. That rather than there being these sort of mystical black swans or unknown unknowns, Taleb is another person who writes about this, I think in very misleading ways. Instead, let's turn this on its head and ask, how can a government and a governing system be hungry for knowledge and insight from all sources, not just from the top of the hierarchies, not just from the experts, but combining data, lived experience, insight, imagination from all sources, so that we can collectively solve our shared problems. And that, to me, must be the, I hope, the vision of what good government is in the future. I will stop there. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Geoff, for the very inspiring keynote. For us, I mean, the hunger for knowledge, it's definitely a huge topic for us, because we always address how can we also find new sources of knowledge, and how can we make sure that knowledge circulates. And we have also a question from one of our participants who asked, what future skills do we need to really prepare ourselves and get ready? And in particular, if we look at our education system and higher education, what would you say are the future skills, and how can we make sure that the next generation also has the right skills to be prepared?
So I've been a bureaucrat much of my life, but I'm now in a university. And I'm just, in fact, later today, we are finishing plans for a big program we will be doing with 1,600 engineering students next year. And obviously engineering students have to learn about engineering and materials and so on, but we try and build into the course a whole program where they work on real life problem solving in teams. In this case, it will be on air quality, What can you do in terms of changing buildings and vehicles, but also policy and regulation and behavior to achieve dramatic improvements in air quality? And I think this is needed in schools as well, where school children are not only learning their physics and chemistry and history and geography, but getting experience of real life practical problem solving in teams on things in their communities. And to me, this is the heart of what future schools, future oriented universities should be doing. There's lots of methods now for incorporating this into curriculums. And it then becomes quite useful for governments, because it means any city government can be actually working with thousands of students, and maybe their ideas won't all be perfect, but sometimes they will come up with insights which won't occur to the 50-year-old bureaucrat, and especially ones around digital or use of platforms will be much easier, perhaps sometimes for an 18-year-old than for them. So this, to me, again, is part of both the future of education institutions, but actually also this future of government, where all the time it is seeking partners who can generate intelligence of all kinds and then use it.
Thank you. And so you already said what government could do, but do you have one recommendation for us, what we could do to really make sure to find new sources of knowledge and utilize them in a good way? If you think about what could be easy to achieve and also have a high impact, just for us as a takeaway, what would be the one thing where you say, if you do that, that's a perfect starting point?
Well, I sort of break down that question into different components. So I would usually take a particular topic, like net zero, or care for the elderly is another one I'm working on a lot at the moment. And then in each field, the question is, how are you organizing the evidence, the knowledge? And not just organizing it, but as you said, Marta, making it easy to use, making it useful. And in the case of something like care for the elderly, that's how do you get that relevant to frontline staff, not just to policymakers. And that's quite a big design task. How can you reorganize the data? So that is providing constant feedback. Again, in the case of the care system, not just on things like infections, but also well-being. Are people thriving? And if they're not thriving, why not? And so again, maybe because I'm in an engineering department, I like breaking problems down, turning them into lots of soluble elements rather than having a single answer to your question. So yeah, think like an engineer a little bit, break them down, but be systematic. And as I guess the main point I would make, in most governing systems, the things I have described are not core to anyone's job. We will have armies of people responsible for money and finance or audit and so on, but almost no one responsible for the orchestration and use of knowledge and data across a system. So maybe my one answer then is to make sure that your ministers and others realize they have to institutionalize these 21st century models of governance and not just have them on the margins in a few pilots.
Thank you. Maybe one last question from one of our participants who asked how, from your global perspective, how relevant is a collective community approach? And he also asked if you have or could share an interesting example.
It depends what you mean by a collective community approach. I mean, perhaps just to comment on social capital and the pandemic, which is very live. All over the world, we saw an extraordinary upsurge of collective community action in response to lockdowns, the creation of food banks, food distribution services, visiting for the sick or the frail elderly who couldn't get out. And that's in some ways been a wonderful story. If you then look in more detail, it turns out that's also been a source of inequality, because some places have done that very well, had strong social capital, others didn't. And nearly always, we found that it's the places where there's a good partnership between the local state, municipalities, and civil society have done this best, when they're able to work on a sort of equal footing together. Because often the local authority will have access to, say, data and resources. And that's probably the biggest finding from the various studies across Europe of the last 20 months. And in some countries that works very well. In most, it doesn't. In most, they don't have mutual trust, or the municipality is too bossy and controlling, or doesn't like talking to civil society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we will be bringing out a series of reviews of both case studies and evidence on this, hopefully so that when there's another pandemic, we are more ready to mobilize all of that collective, not just intelligence, but actually also collective empathy and willingness to help and commit to support each other, which we probably need for lots of other things too.
Excellent, thank you so much. So hunger for knowledge and supporting each other. I think these are the key main sentences for me to really take away, and also we could transport this to the entire festival and say, this is what we are doing, and learning from each other and sharing best practices will keep us moving forward. Thank you so much, Geoff, for joining us this morning.
Thank you. And I'm just going to put in the chat an answer to the other question about one of the reports which I mentioned. So
perfect. Yes, that would be great if you could share the report. Thank you.
Thank you.